In the summer of 1878, 47 souls in Harper County, Kansas begged God to spare them from typhoid, for brothers prayed harder than anyone, and something answered, but whatever came back was no longer human. The prairie does not forgive. In 1878, it stretched west of Cedar Ridge like a golden ocean frozen mid-wave, every stalk of wheat bending in perfect obedience to a wind that never seemed to stop. When storms came, the sky turned the color of old bruises, and lightning crawled from horizon to horizon like the fingers of something trying to pry the world open. Men and women who lived beneath that sky learned early that they were small, that their lives were borrowed, and that the Lord, when he finally spoke, rarely used gentle words. That summer he spoke with fever. It began quietly, the way judgment often does. July 15th. Sarah Hartman opened the general store at sunrise, humming "Nearer, My God, to Thee," while she swept the plank floor. She greeted the Henderson boys, poured coffee for old Mr. Zimmerman, laughed when little Tommy Patterson bragged about his new colt. By noon her hands shook so badly she dropped a jar of molasses. By 3 o'clock she was burning alive. Dr. Samuel Morrison arrived on a lathered horse, medical bag slapping against his thigh. He found Sarah on a cot behind the counter, skin blotched with rose-colored spots that looked painted on, eyes rolled back to whites. Her temperature would not register on his thermometer. The mercury climbed past the final mark and kept rising until the glass cracked in his hand. Benjamin Hartman knelt beside her, clutching her fingers as if he could wring the sickness out. "She was singing this morning," he kept saying, voice breaking.
"Singing, some.
How does a body turn to fire in 5 hours? Sarah died at 12:07 a.m. But death did not take her cleanly. Rigor mortis came within minutes, locking her limbs at impossible angles. Her skin cooled to the temperature of well water yet kept the faint, waxy sheen of something embalmed while still breathing moments earlier. Worst of all were her eyes. Dr. Morrison closed them 3 times. Each time the lids rose again on their own, revealing pupils that had dilated until only a thin ring of hazel remained, like a solar eclipse frozen at totality. He wrote in his ledger with shaking hands, "Patient exhibits post-mortem reflexes inconsistent with known physiology. Eyes refuse closure. Recommend immediate burial." They buried her at dawn. The grave was shallow, the ground baked iron-hard by weeks without rain. When the first shovelful of dirt struck the pine box, everyone present swore they heard a single note, clear and high, rise from beneath the lid. A woman's voice, still singing. Within a week the well was condemned. Within 2 weeks, 14 fresh graves scarred the hillside behind the Methodist church. But on the northern edge of the county, for men did not fall ill. Not once. Ezra, Caleb, Josiah, Abel Blackwood. They had come west in 72. For black-bearded brothers driving 2 wagons loaded with Bibles, plows, and a conviction that burned hotter than any prairie sun. They bought a full section, 640 acres of virgin soil no white man had yet broken, and set to work with the relentless patience of men who believed the land itself had been waiting for them. People said they looked alike enough to be one soul split 4 ways. Same height, same pale winter blue eyes, same hands scarred by the same tools. Even their beards, trimmed every Sabbath to exact length, grew in identical waves of midnight black. But they were not the same. Ezra, 36, carried the weight of command in his shoulders. He spoke rarely, but when he did the wind itself seemed to listen. Men twice his age stepped aside when Ezra walked into a room, not out of fear, but because something in those pale eyes made them feel suddenly transparent, as if he could read the ledger of their sins simply by looking. Caleb, 34, was the calculator. He could glance at a field and tell you within 10 bushels what it would yield. His account books were things of beauty, columns aligned like soldiers, every cent accounted for, every debt to God and man recorded in ink so black it looked wet years later. He saw divine mathematics in everything. The spiral of a sunflower, the ratio of rain to harvest, the precise moment a cow would calve. Josiah, 31, was the scholar. 2 years at Ohio Wesleyan had left him with a hunger no prairie could satisfy. He read until the candles guttered, lips moving silently over Greek and Hebrew, Latin and German. His room smelled of lamp oil and old paper and something sharper. Ozone, maybe, as if lightning lived between the pages. And then there was Abel, 25, the one who frightened even his own brothers. Abel did not read the word. He consumed it. He fasted until his cheekbones cast shadows sharp enough to cut bread. When he prayed, he wept, great, tearing sobs that shook his whole frame. Neighbors who heard him through open windows at night crossed themselves, though they were Methodist and didn't believe in such things. Once, during a drought, Abel walked barefoot into the fields at midnight, arms raised to a sky without stars, and begged aloud for rain. The next morning the creek ran bankful and the wheat stood green and laughing. People stopped calling it coincidence after the third time. They built their chapel in 1873. Not a church, a chapel. 30 feet long, 20 wide, quarried limestone fitted so dry, without mortar because mortar, Josiah said, was the work of hired hands and they had none. The altar was a single slab of walnut planed so smooth you could see your reflection in it. Across the front, carved in letters deep enough to hold yesterday's shadows, ran the Hebrew none of the neighbors could read.
Kadosh 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 Yevat Tzvaot.
Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. Every dawn they met there, for silhouettes against the rising sun, kneeling on the puncheon floor, heads bowed in absolute silence for 1 full hour. You could stand at the fence and hear nothing but wind and the faint creak of leather Bibles opening in perfect unison. They did not marry. They did not drink. They did not dance, play cards, or speak idly. When harvest help was needed, they paid double the going wage and fed the men like kings, but no worker ever spent the night under their roof. Something in the house made sleep impossible. Men woke gasping, sheets soaked, dreaming of eyes watching from corners that had no corners. By the summer of 1878, the Blackwood farm was the envy of Harper County. Wheat twice as high as any neighbor's, cattle fat and sleek, a silo so full the boards groaned. And not one cough, not one fever, not one rose-colored spot. While Cedar Ridge buried its dead in rows that grew longer every sunrise, the 4 brothers worked their fields bare-chested under a merciless sun, singing hymns in 4-part harmony that carried for miles. Old women listening from their porches crossed themselves again. Dr. Morrison rode out on July 29th. He found the brothers in the south field, guiding a McCormick reaper pulled by 4 matched mules. The machine's blades flashed like scythes of judgment. When they saw the doctor, they stopped as one man. "Afternoon, Brother Morrison," Ezra said, voice calm as deep water. The other 3 simply nodded. Samuel Morrison had delivered babies and set bones for 15 years. He had watched strong men die screaming. But something in the stillness of those 4 faces made the horse shy beneath him. "I've come to examine you," he said, hearing his own voice crack like a boy's. 29 dead in 3 weeks. Same water table. Same air. Yet you 4. He gestured helplessly at their sun-browned arms, their clear eyes. "You haven't so much as sneezed." Josiah stepped forward, wiping chaff from his beard. "The Lord is our shield and buckler, Doctor." Psalm 91. Morrison dismounted. He took their pulses, steady, strong. Listened to hearts that beat slow and deliberate, like clocks keeping perfect celestial time. Checked tongues, eyes, skin. Drew blood with a lancet into 4 small glasses. The blood looked wrong. Too dark. Too thick. When he held the glasses to the light, it did not bead and run like normal blood. It clung to the glass in heavy droplets that refused to fall, as if gravity itself had forgotten them. He asked them to remove their shirts. Beneath the sun-bleached fabric, their torsos were unmarked. No rose spots, no scars except the honest ones earned by work. But across each man's chest, directly over the heart, was a mark none of them had been born with. A perfect circle of raised white flesh, no larger than a silver dollar. Inside the circle, faint lines intersected, too regular to be scars, too deliberate to be accidental. They looked burned in, branded by something that had never been hot. Morrison's hand trembled as he traced one with a fingertip. The skin was cold, unnaturally cold, "What is this?" he whispered. Abel answered, and for the first time Morrison heard something beneath the youngest brother's voice, an echo, as if another tongue spoke half a second behind the first. "His seal," Abel said softly, "the seal of the living God." That night Dr. Morrison wrote a letter to the Kansas State Medical Board. He sealed it with wax and his own trembling hand. 3 days later 2 men in black frock coats arrived from Topeka. They spent one afternoon on the Blackwood farm. They left before supper and never spoke of what they saw. The letter was never opened. The file was created, stamped confidential in red, and buried so deep in the state archives that even today researchers are told it does not exist. But the people of Cedar Ridge noticed other things. The brothers' shadows grew faint. On bright afternoons when every other man cast a shadow sharp enough to shave by, the Blackwoods lay pale and watery on the ground, as if the sun itself was reluctant to touch them. Their voices changed. When they sang hymns now, dogs for miles around began to howl in agony. Once, during prayer meeting in town, a rare visit, Abel began to speak in tongues. Not the gentle glossolalia some Methodists accepted. Something harsher, older. Mrs. Patterson fainted dead away. When they revived her, she could only whisper. It wasn't a language. It was answering him. And the eyes. Lord God, the eyes. By late August, they no longer reflected firelight the way human eyes do. They drank it, held it, gave it back hours later in the dark like cats. Children began having nightmares of 4 tall men standing at the foot of their beds, watching. Not threatening, simply watching, waiting. On September 1st, Dr. Morrison made one final visit. He brought his Bible. He found the brothers in their chapel at dusk. The windows blazed blood-red with the dying sun. The 4 of them knelt before the altar, heads bowed, hands resting on the walnut slab. Morrison's boots echoed on the puncheon floor. Ezra spoke without turning. "You should not have come, Samuel." "I have to know," the doctor said. "People are saying you bargained, that you asked for protection." And something heard. Slowly the brothers rose. In the crimson light they looked taller than possible. Their shadows, if shadows they still cast, stretched the full length of the chapel and kept stretching, climbing the back wall like smoke. Josiah opened the great family Bible on the altar. The pages turned by themselves though no wind stirred the air. He read aloud, voice calm and terrible. "And the 4 angels were loosed, which were prepared for an hour, and a day, and a month, and a year, and the number of the army of the horsemen were 200,000. Morrison dropped to his knees, not in reverence. His legs simply gave out. Caleb looked at him with something that might once have been pity. "We asked to be spared," he said gently. "We did not ask what the price would be." Abel smiled then. It was the first time anyone in Cedar Ridge could remember seeing Abel Blackwood smile. His teeth were too white, too sharp, too many. The chapel door slammed shut though no hand had touched it. Outside the wind died. The prairie held its breath. And somewhere in the gathering dark, 47 graves waited for company that would never come. Because whatever walked the Blackwood farm now was beyond the reach of typhoid, beyond the reach of death, beyond the reach, perhaps, of mercy itself. The plague did not spread at random. It chose. One house would lose every soul by sunrise. The next farm over would wake untouched, coffee still warm on the stove. Widows nailed quilts over windows so death could not see inside. Fathers sat on porches all night with loaded rifles across their knees, daring the fever to come on foot so they could shoot it like a wolf. The Methodist Church held one final Sunday service on July 30th. Only 9 people came. Reverend Thorne preached to rows of empty pews while the bell in the steeple rang itself in the wind. Slow, mournful notes that sounded like a warning no one wanted to hear. By the second week of August, Cedar Ridge was a town learning how loud silence can be. And still the 4 Blackwood brothers did not fall. On the night of August 10, 1878, a thin new moon hung over the prairie like a clipped silver nail. Inside the limestone chapel, a single tallow candle burned on the altar. The brothers knelt in their usual places. Ezra north, Caleb south, Josiah east, Abel west. forming a perfect cross of living flesh. Josiah spoke first. His voice was soft, but the walls themselves seemed to lean in to listen. "I have seen it," he said. "In the watches of the night the Lord stood at the foot of my bed. Not in glory, in sorrow. He showed me the children burning. He showed me the ledger, 47 names already written in his book, and more being added every hour." Then he asked a question. Josiah lifted his head. In the candlelight his eyes looked wet, but no tears fell. He asked if we were willing to stand in their place. Silence thick as felt filled the chapel. Even the candle flame froze. Ezra's answer came low, steady, final. "We are." Abel began to weep. Not the wild sobbing of his earlier devotions, but a quiet, relentless stream that soaked his beard and dripped onto the puncheon floor. Where each tear struck the wood, the grain darkened as though drinking it in. Caleb opened the great Bible, placed his finger on a verse, and read aloud without looking. "Greater love hath no man than this." They did not sleep that night. They prayed until the candle guttered, until the moon bled out in the west, until the first pale blade of dawn slid through the east window and cut across their upturned faces. Then they went to work. August 11th broke hot and still. Heat devils danced above the fields. Josiah rode into Cedar Ridge alone. Coat buttoned to the throat despite the temperature. Hat pulled low. Children playing in the street saw him coming and ran inside without being called. His first stop was the Fletcher house. Timothy Fletcher, 8 years old, lay rigid on a cornshuck mattress. Spine arched so violently only his heels and the back of his head touched the sheets. Rose spots covered him like a rash of fresh blood. His mother rocked in a corner, rosary forgotten in her lap, humming the same 3 notes over and over because words had left her. Josiah removed his hat. He knelt. The room was 20 feet square. Every person in it later swore it suddenly felt no bigger than a coffin. He laid both hands on the boy's forehead. The skin was so hot it blistered Josiah's palms on contact. He did not flinch. Then he prayed, not the gentle cadence of a bedside blessing, but a demand spoken in a voice that seemed to come from the rafters and the floorboards at the same time. "Father of mercies and God of all comfort, if this cup cannot pass from the child, then let it pass to us. Let every degree of burning, every spasm, every moment of terror be gathered up and poured into these 4 bodies you have kept whole for this hour. Take what is ours, our breath, our blood, our very humanity, and give it back healed to the innocent." A sound came out of Timothy then, half scream, half sigh. His body unarched as though an invisible hand had straightened him. The rose spots faded before their eyes, shrinking like embers under water. Color returned to his lips. He blinked once, twice, and asked in a small, puzzled voice, "Ma, is supper ready?" His mother's scream of joy rattled the window panes. But no one was looking at Timothy anymore. They were looking at Josiah. His knees buckled. He caught himself on the edge of the bed, knuckles white. Beneath his beard his skin had gone scarlet, as though the fever had leapt straight from the boy into him. His eyes, those pale winter eyes, now held flecks of molten gold that moved like living things beneath the iris. He stood with visible effort. "Thank the Lord," he rasped, and the words scraped out like gravel. Then he walked out into the blinding daylight and mounted his horse as if nothing had happened. He visited 9 more houses that day, 9 more children, 9 more sudden, impossible recoveries. By sunset he could barely sit his saddle. Ezra met him on the porch, caught him as he slid from the horse, carried him inside like a child. Josiah's skin was so hot the air above him rippled. Yet he smiled, a terrible, radiant smile. "It's working, brother," he whispered. "They're healing. It's magnificent." That night all 4 brothers locked themselves in the chapel. They did not emerge for 3 days. When Dr. Morrison arrived on August 18th, summoned by a note written in Josiah's once elegant hand but now shaky and strange, he almost turned back at the gate. The farm looked wrong. The wheat, golden and ready for harvest everywhere else in the county, had turned a deeper, almost metallic green, as though each stalk had been dipped in verdigris. The cattle stood motionless in the pasture, heads lowered, not grazing. Even the wind seemed to die the moment his wagon wheels crossed the property line. Ezra opened the door before Morrison could knock. The eldest brother had always been imposing. Now he was something else. His skin had gone translucent. Beneath it, veins glowed, not red, but liquid gold, pulsing with slow, deliberate light. When he spoke, the sound arrived twice. Once from his mouth, once from somewhere deeper, as if his ribs themselves had learned to form words. "Welcome, Doctor. You kept records of our humanity. Now you will witness what comes after." Inside, the parlor had been stripped bare. No furniture. Only the four brothers arranged at the points of a perfect square, seated cross-legged on the floor, eyes closed. They breathed in perfect synchronization, one inhalation every 37 seconds. Morrison counted. He approached Ezra first. The man's temperature registered 107.4 degrees Fahrenheit. His heart rate, 28 beats per minute. Yet he rose smoothly and walked to the window as if gravity had become negotiable. Caleb opened his eyes next. Rose spots covered him from collarbone to wrists, but they were no longer random. They formed precise, interlocking circles and spirals, sacred geometry etched in blood. As Morrison watched, the pattern rearranged itself, numbers flickering across Caleb's chest like brands cooling and reheating. Caleb smiled serenely. "The equations balance," he said, and every word arrived in four-part harmony, though only his lips moved. "Matter equals spirit at the point of perfect surrender. We are the proof." Josiah sat with his back to the north wall. His skin had become parchment, thin, almost translucent, covered with row upon row of tiny script. Hebrew on his throat, Greek across his collarbones, Latin over his heart, and something else, lines and curves that hurt to look at directly, as though the eye refused to focus on shapes never meant for human sight. When he spoke, the words came from everywhere and nowhere. "We are being written upon," he said, voice soft as turning pages. "Every healing we took into ourselves inscribed another line of the eternal text. Soon the book will be complete, and we will no longer need flesh to contain it." Abel was worst. He glowed. A cold, blue-white radiance poured from his pores, from his eyes, from the roots of his hair. The light did not flicker like fire. It was constant, sourceless, the way moonlight looks when it falls on deep water. His eyes had no pupils left, only twin spheres of frozen starlight. He floated 6 inches above the floor. Not dramatically. He simply hovered, knees still crossed, hands resting on thighs, as calm as a man waiting for coffee. "We do not eat," Abel said, and his voice arrived inside Morrison's skull more than his ears. "We do not sleep. We draw breath only to speak. The plague is in us now. All of it. We are its vessel. And it is content." Morrison's thermometer slipped from his fingers and shattered. He backed toward the door. His heel crunched on glass. He had not realized he was standing in the ruins of his own medical bag. Ezra, no longer entirely Ezra, watched him with gentle pity. "You will try to explain this with science," the thing wearing Ezra's face said. "You will fail, but write it anyway. One day the world will be ready to read what you saw today." Outside, the sky had gone strange. The sun hung low and red, but clouds moved against the wind, racing eastward as though fleeing something rising in the west. The wheat in the north field bowed, not in the breeze, but all at once, in perfect unison, as if an invisible hand had pressed every stalk flat in the shape of an immense circle bisected by a cross. Morrison fled. He wrote his report that night by lamplight, hands trembling so badly the ink spidered across the page. He sealed it with wax and his own blood, pricked his thumb without thinking, and rode hard for the county seat. The report never arrived. 2 men in black frock coats met him on the road at midnight. They took the pages. They took his journal. They took the broken thermometer and the scraps of his dignity. One of them spoke only once. "This matter is ended, Doctor. Go home. Speak of it again and Cedar Ridge will need a new physician." The typhoid epidemic ended as suddenly as it began. By the first frost, the new well was sweet, The graves were mounded with fresh dirt and simple wooden markers, and people began to speak in normal voices again. But no one went near the Blackwood farm. Pilgrims came at first. Desperate parents, curious preachers, a photographer from Wichita who wanted to capture living miracles. They were turned away at the gate. Politely, always politely. Those who crept close at night told stories no one wanted to believe. For figures working the fields after moonset, moving without lanterns because they carried their own light. For voices rising from the chapel in song that made dogs claw their ears bloody. Shadows that stretched too far, detached from the men who cast them, and moved with purposes of their own. And once, just once, Eleanor Patterson swore she saw Abel standing alone in the wheat at 3 a.m., arms outstretched, head tilted back. The glow pouring from him was bright enough to read by. Above him the stars were going out one by one, as though something vast was drinking them. She ran home and nailed her Bible to the inside of the front door. Years later, when the county built a new road, surveyors found the Blackwood section untouched. The chapel still stood. The house still stood. But the fields were green in December, and deep furrows spelled words across the wheat in a language no one recognized. Letters 30 feet tall, perfectly formed, as though plowed by something that had all the time in the world. The brothers were never seen in town again. But sometimes, on nights when the wind comes hard out of the north, travelers on the old stage road report hearing four male voices singing in perfect harmony. The sound is beautiful, devastating, and it is getting closer. October 15, 1878. Cedar Ridge, Kansas. The nights were growing colder, but the fear was hotter than ever. Children began to vanish. Not stolen in the usual brutal way of the frontier. No blood, no screams, no tracks leading to some desperate outlaw's campfire. They simply walked out of their beds in the small hours, barefoot in their nightgowns, and were found hours later standing motionless in the Blackwood wheat. Faces tilted to the stars as though listening to music only they could hear. When carried home they were fever-warm, eyes shining gold, speaking in soft, adult voices about the coming refinement and the fire that does not consume. Sarah Preston, 7 years old, was the first. Her father found her at dawn sitting cross-legged on the chapel altar, palms open on her knees exactly like Abel. She turned when Thomas Preston burst through the doors, and smiled with a serenity no child should possess. Hello, Papa. The brothers let me read from the book that writes itself. It has my name in it now. See, she held out her tiny arms. Across the soft skin of her forearms, faint lines of golden script were already forming. Hebrew letters that crawled and rearranged themselves even as he watched, like ants made of light. Thomas Preston carried her out screaming. Dr. Morrison arrived within the hour. The girl's temperature was 103.8 degrees Fahrenheit and climbing. Her pupils had contracted to pinpricks ringed with molten gold. When he shone a light into her eyes, the glow did not reflect back. It poured out, blinding him for minutes. That was the day the town broke. Morrison had been making weekly visits to the farm since August, each one stripping another layer of certainty from his mind. He kept a private journal now, written in a frantic scrawl that looked nothing like the careful physician's hand of a year earlier. October 3rd. Ezra's temperature, 106.7 degrees Fahrenheit steady for 12 days. No seizure. No delirium. No end organ damage. He asked me today why I still bother with the thermometer. When he smiled, I felt my will bend the way iron bends in a blacksmith's fire. I left agreeing with statements I do not remember hearing. October 9th. Caleb's markings have begun to emit faint sound, almost subaudible, like a choir heard through water. I held a stethoscope to his chest and heard not a heartbeat but voices reciting prime numbers in Greek. When I tried to draw blood, the needle bent sideways as though repelled by an unseen field. The single drop that finally welled up did not fall when the glass tube was inverted. It floated inside the tube like a golden seed suspended in amber. October 12th. Josiah no longer speaks with his mouth. The words arrive directly behind my eyes, printed in fire across the inside of my skull. Today he apologized for the discomfort. He said the process is almost complete and soon, The translation will be perfect. New script appears on his skin faster than I can copy it. Some passages are in languages I know. Others hurt to read. My vision blurs and my nose begins to bleed. October 14th. Abel does not touch the ground anymore. He hovers a hand's breadth above the puncheon floor, radiating cold light that makes my breath visible even at noon. He knew I was coming before I left town. He greeted me by naming the exact thoughts I had confessed to no one, not even my wife, about ending my own life to escape what I have seen. He forgave me for them. The journal ends there. The next page is burned away, edges blackened as though held to a flame. By late October, the Blackwood farm had become a place parents spoke of only in whispers. Children were locked in at dusk with chairs jammed under doorknobs. Bibles were nailed over windows. Reverend Thorne stopped preaching on Sunday mornings and began preaching against false prophets in our midst who wear the garments of righteousness but speak with the tongue of serpents. On October 25th, the town meeting was held in the schoolhouse because the church felt too holy a place for what had to be said. Every bench was filled. Men stood 3 deep along the walls. Oil lamps hissed. The air stank of sweat and terror and too many bodies in too small a space. Mayor Harrison pounded for order with a boot on the teacher's desk. "We are God-fearing people," he began, voice cracking. "But something unholy walks among us wearing the faces of men we once called brothers." Dr. Morrison spoke next. He looked 10 years older than the man who had delivered half the babies in the room. "I have watched for human beings rewrite the laws of creation," he said quietly. "They are not sick. They are not mad. They are becoming something our science has no name for, and our Bibles only warn against. And now it is spreading. Sarah Preston is only the first. If we do nothing, by spring every child in Cedar Ridge will carry their mark." Thomas Preston stood up, face streaked with tears and fury. "My little girl speaks in tongues she never learned. She says the angels have bellies full of fire and teeth like stars. She says when the change is finished she will not need her body anymore. I want my daughter back." The vote was unanimous. They would give the Blackwood brothers 7 days. Leave Kansas forever, or be driven out by whatever means necessary. November 1st, 1878. All Saints' Day. The delegation left town at dawn. Mayor Harrison, Reverend Thorne, Thomas Preston, Dr. Morrison, and 6 armed men who had volunteered because someone had to. The sky was the color of old pewter. A cold wind knifed out of the north, driving swirls of dead leaves before it like lost souls. As they crested the last rise, the Blackwood farm came into view, and every man felt the same lurch in his gut. The wheat still stood. In November, golden and heavy and wrong, rippling though the wind had died the moment they crossed the property line. The cattle had arranged themselves into a perfect circle in the south pasture, heads inward, motionless as statues. And the chapel, the limestone chapel, glowed from within with a cold white light that pulsed like a heartbeat. Sarah Preston was waiting for them on the porch. She wore a clean pinafore and held a rag doll by one arm. Her eyes were molten gold now, no trace of childhood blue remaining. "Hello, Papa," she said, and her voice carried the same harmonic overtones the brothers had developed. "They knew you were coming. They left the door open." Thomas lunged for her. She did not move, but he stopped as though he had run into a wall. An invisible pressure pressed him back, gentle but immovable. Inside the house, every lamp was lit though it was morning. The parlor was empty of furniture. Only a single leather-bound journal lay open on the floor, pages turning themselves though no wind stirred the air. Reverend Thorne began to pray aloud, voice shaking. The pages turned faster. They found the brothers in the chapel. The doors stood open. Inside, the 4 Blackwoods knelt in their customary square around the altar, except they no longer knelt on the floor. They hovered, 6 inches above the puncheon planks, bodies perfectly aligned, palms resting on knees, faces tilted upward. Their skin had gone completely translucent. Beneath it, no heart beat, no lungs expanded. Instead, rivers of golden fire moved in slow, deliberate patterns, circuitry of light where organs should have been. Their eyes were not eyes anymore but wells of living gold that reflected nothing in the room. Only vast distances, burning cities, turning galaxies. Ezra spoke first, but all four mouths moved in perfect synchronization. You have come to cast us out. The words arrived inside every man's skull simultaneously, printed in letters of white fire. Mayor Harrison found his voice. This land is no longer yours. You will leave Kansas by sundown tomorrow, or we will make you leave. Caleb laughed, a sound like a choir of glass bells shattering in reverse. We have already left. Josiah's parchment skin flickered with new lines of script racing across his chest, his throat, his face. You mistake the garment for the wearer. The words wrote themselves as he spoke. These bodies were only scaffolding. The work is finished. Abel rose higher, slowly, serenely, until he floated a full yard above the altar. The cold light pouring from him was bright enough to cast razor-sharp shadows on the back wall. For shadows, but the shadows were wrong. They were taller, winged, many-headed, and they moved independently of the bodies that should have cast them. Thomas Preston fell to his knees. What have you done with my daughter? Sarah's voice answered from the doorway behind them. Sweet, piping, terrible. I'm right here, Papa. I just don't need the doll anymore. The rag doll lay on the threshold. Its button eyes had been replaced with flecks of gold. Dr. Morrison stepped forward, voice raw. Whatever you are, whatever you've become, release the children. They don't belong to you. Ezra, or what wore Ezra's shape, turned its golden gaze on him. They were never yours to keep, Samuel. Only to borrow. The refinement comes to all flesh in time. We merely accelerated the process. Reverend Thorne raised his crucifix with shaking hands. In the name of Jesus Christ I command. The crucifix burst into white flame. Thorne dropped it with a cry. The silver cross melted into a puddle on the floor, hissing like a snake. The four floating figures began to rise in unison. Higher. Through the roof beams. Through the oak shingles. The chapel roof did not break. Simply ceased to be solid where their bodies passed, as though reality itself had agreed to step aside. The delegation stumbled outside in time to see them. For luminous figures ascending slowly above the chapel, arms outstretched, faces radiant with impossible joy. Behind them, every stalk of wheat in every field bowed flat at once, forming an immense golden cross a quarter-mile wide, visible for miles in every direction. Their voices rolled across the prairie like thunder made of music. Tell them the door is open. Tell them the fire is kind. Tell them we will wait, but not forever. Then they were gone, simply gone. No fading into the clouds, no trail of light. One moment they hung against the iron sky like four new constellations. The next, the sky was empty. Only the wheat cross remained. And the children, every child who had wandered to the farm in the night now stood at the edge of the fields. Dozens of them. Faces upturned, eyes shining gold, mouths open in silent song. Sarah Preston walked to her father and took his hand. Don't cry, Papa, she whispered. They didn't take us. They showed us where we were going all along. We'll see you again, when you're ready to come home. That night, Dr. Morrison burned his journals in the stove. The next day, the state officials arrived. 3 days early, faces pale, orders terse. They took statements. They took photographs that came out blank. They took the leather-bound journal and every scrap of paper on the farm. They ordered the chapel razed. When the men approached with axes, the building was already empty. Only a single sentence had been carved into the altar in letters a foot deep. They are not gone. They are waiting. The wheat cross resisted every harvest. Year after year it grew back in perfect cruciform shape while the rest of the section reverted to prairie grass. In 1892 the county tried to plow it under. The blades shattered. The horses refused to cross the boundary. Today, if you know where to look, on certain cloudless nights when the moon is new, you can still see 4 pale lights hovering above the old Blackwood section, moving in slow, eternal circles. And sometimes, from the dark between the stars, comes the sound of children singing in voices that have not aged a single day since 1878. November 1st, 1878. the chapel on Blackwood Hill. The delegation stood inside a silence so complete they could hear their own hearts trying to hammer their ribs apart. The four brothers, no longer quite bodies, hovered in perfect formation above the altar, wrapped in cold white fire. Their translucent skin revealed galaxies of golden circuitry where blood and bone had once been. The air itself bent around them, shimmering like heat above a forge. Mayor Harrison found the courage first. "You have 7 days," he said, voice cracking like thin ice. "7 days to leave this county forever, or we will drag what's left of you out ourselves." Ezra smiled. All four faces smiled at once. Caleb answered, and the words arrived inside every skull at the same moment, printed in letters of living gold. "We have already left, William. You are speaking to echoes wearing familiar clothes." Reverend Thorne thrust his Bible forward like a shield. "The Lord formed man from the dust and breathed into him the breath of life. Whatever you are now is an abomination of that design." Josiah's laughter was the sound of 1,000 chapel bells ringing underwater. Abomination! The word wrote itself across his chest in flowing Hebrew, then burned away like flash paper. "Beloved, now are we the sons of God, and it doth not yet appear what we shall be." He drifted closer. The temperature in the chapel plummeted 20 degrees. "We are what the promise looked like when it finally kept its word." Thomas Preston had heard enough theology. He lunged toward the altar, arms outstretched for his daughter. "Give me back my little girl." Sarah stepped between her father and the floating figures. 7 years old, barefoot in a cotton nightgown, eyes twin furnaces of molten gold. "Papa," she said gently, "I was never yours to keep. I was only loaned." She placed her small hand on his chest. The moment skin touched wool, Thomas Preston experienced the consciousness bridge. Time dilated. He saw everything. He saw the moment Josiah's prayer over Timothy Fletcher tore open a door that was never meant to close. He saw the plague not as disease but as invitation, an ancient refining fire wearing the mask of typhoid so frightened men would let it in. He saw the four brothers kneeling in their chapel night after night, begging to become the sacrifice that would spare the innocent, and something older than the prairie answering yes. He saw his daughter's soul, bright as a newborn star, step willingly into that fire and laugh for joy as the flames kissed her clean. When the vision released him, Thomas was on his knees weeping, not from grief but from a love so vast it threatened to unmake him. Dr. Morrison was last to receive the bridge. They did not ask permission. One moment he stood clutching his medical bag. The next he was everywhere at once. He felt the thoughts of every soul in Cedar Ridge, grief, terror, guilty hope. He watched storms forming over Colorado 3 days hence. He heard the wheat growing beneath the frozen ground, whispering in root language older than speech. He looked into the brothers and saw not 4 men but one vast organism wearing 4 faces, ancient, patient, and hungry for the rest of its body to come home. He understood, with crystalline horror, that the transformation had never been about survival. It was recruitment. When awareness slammed back into his single, fragile skull, Morrison screamed. A raw animal sound that echoed off limestone walls and would not stop. He ran. He ran until his lungs bled, until the horse collapsed beneath him, until he reached the edge of the county and kept running. He burned every note, every drawing, every vial of golden blood. He fled to Oregon under a false name and never spoke of Kansas again. But some doors, once opened, do not close. December 15, 1878. Thomas Preston found Ezra first. The eldest brother lay on the chapel floor in the exact center of the wheat-made cross that had been burned into the puncheon planks years earlier. His body looked mummified, skin like scorched parchment, golden eyes reduced to dull glass discs. There was no wound, no decay in the usual sense. Only a profound emptiness, as though something immense had simply stepped out of the suit it had been wearing. Caleb was discovered 3 days later in the north field, seated upright in the wheat that now stood 8 feet tall in December. The stalks had woven themselves into a perfect throne around him. His rose spot patterns had rearranged one final time, into a single word repeated in every known human script and 1,000 more no scholar has ever seen. Soon, Josiah was found at his desk, quill still in hand. The page before him was blank except for a single line written in his own blood, now oxidized black. The book is finished. The readers must now become the text. Abel was last. They found him hanging in the barn, except no rope held him. He floated 3 feet above the hay, arms outstretched, head bowed as if in prayer. The cold light that had once poured from him now pulsed faintly, like a heart that had forgotten how to stop. When the undertaker tried to cut him down, the body dissolved into ash at the first touch. The ash did not fall. It hung in the air, forming 4 perfect silhouettes that slowly drifted apart, passing through the barn walls as though they had never existed. The church buried what little remained in 4 unmarked graves behind the ruined chapel.
No autopsies.
No sermons. Just 4 pine boxes lowered into frozen ground while the wind screamed across the prairie like a living thing. The official record reads, Ezra, Caleb, Josiah, and Abel Blackwood died of complications of typhoid fever, December 1878. But the prairie remembers differently. 1923. A construction crew broke ground for a new town on the old Blackwood section. They lasted 3 days. Jackhammers refused to bite the earth where the chapel had stood. Bulldozers rolled onto the property and simply stopped, engines flooding as though drowning. At night the men saw children, dozens of them, standing at the edge of the wheat cross that had grown back greener than ever. The children never moved. They only watched with golden eyes and smiled when the men began to scream. The project was abandoned. The land was given to the state. The gates are chained. The signs read, closed for environmental restoration. But the locals know better. They know that on the shortest day of the year, when the sun dies at 4:17 p.m. and the prairie goes darker than any city child can imagine, 4 pale figures walk the section lines again. They do not speak. They only wait. And sometimes, when a car breaks down on the old county road and a traveler steps out into the freezing dark, they hear a little girl's voice carried on the wind. We kept the door open, Papa. All you have to do is walk through. In 1954, a state geologist took soil samples near the chapel ruins. Under ultraviolet light, the wheat roots glowed gold. In 1978, a Cessna pilot flying over the preserve at dusk reported 4 heat signatures on infrared, human-shaped, stationary, directly above the old graves. The images were classified. In 1996, a group of teenagers broke through the fence on a dare. Only 3 came back. They refused to speak for 41 days. On the 42nd day, they woke up screaming the same sentence in perfect 4-part harmony. They are not dead. They are waiting. They are patient. They are hungry. And in 2023, satellite imagery revealed something new. Seen from orbit, the wheat cross is no longer a simple cruciform. It has grown. Year by year, decade by decade, the golden wheat has spread outward in perfect geometric increments, forming an immense, intricate sigil that covers the entire 640 acres. A sigil that, when translated by the only linguist brave enough to try, reads in a language older than Sumer. We have become the invitation. Come and be changed. The Blackwood brothers did not die in 1878. They graduated. They laid down the husks they no longer needed and stepped into the fire they had begged for all their lives. And they left the door open behind them. Some nights, if you stand at the fence with the wind in your face and your heart very quiet, you can still hear them. 4 voices braided together in a hymn that has no beginning and no end. They are singing your name. They have all the time in the world. And they are so patient. Screen fades to black. A single line of golden text writes itself across the darkness. The prairie does not forgive. But sometimes, it invites.